is a set of policies and regulations designed to build the 21st century grid. And it has, as its key element, it's market-based. And the reason for markets is the markets mobilize large amounts of money, markets bring innovation, and markets can bring efficiency. So the good news and why markets can work is we know that the grid is energy inefficient and it was not designed energy efficient, but the grid is finite. And one measure for that is average capacity. So I don't know what it is in Quebec, but in New York, average capacity utilization is more than 50%. So it's built for the hottest hours or days of the year, but customers pay for it all year long. And this stands in stark contrast to other capital-intensive industries outside of the utility sector. And really largely due to global competition, other capital-intensive industries have had to dramatically improve their capital efficiency in the last 35 or 40 years, so that they're at 77, 80, 85% capacity utilization. So evolving the electric utility industry in New York to this higher level of average capacity utilization means billions of dollars a year in customer savings or in money that can be used to finance the new grid. And so because the current grid is so financially inefficient, we believe we can largely build the new grid within the cost envelope of the existing bill. So there are three elements of, and I'll talk about each of them quickly. Establishing locational value for DER, changing regulated utility incentives and business practices, and to stimulate grid edge activity with government resources. So let's talk about the first one, establishing locational value. Well, in that the grid of the future that we're supposed to have, we know we're supposed to have distributed nodes. So the question is, where should those distributed nodes be on the grid? And the answer is, it depends on location. It depends on where those distributed resources are going to have the most value. And one example of where they're going to have the most value is inside of load pockets. And New York actually is blessed in purple with many areas of grid constraint, although we call them opportunity zones as opposed to areas of grid constraint. And it's obviously in these areas where producing distributed resources is going to have the most value. And so how do you determine, how do you create a price signal for doing that? Well, the answer was to create a value for distributed energy resources, what we call VEDR, and as opposed to net metering. And so this is the successor to net metering, has these different elements of the value stack, the environmental value, capacity, day ahead locational marginal price, and reduction value. And it wasn't quite enough to be equal initially to net metering. And so we put in a short-term market transition credit. And this was a big deal, getting the solar industry to buy into it, but they have. So the second thing is to change regulated utility incentives and business practices, because establishing a tariff, a locational tariff, a value of distributed energy resources is a very good market signal to the distributed energy industry to drive installations of distributed resources. This is on the grid where it's not just good for the host customer, but provides value to all customers, but it does nothing to change utility financial incentives, because all you're doing when you establish a tariff is just to allocate the total pool of revenues that a utility is going to get. So changing the utility financial incentives, changing the utility business model is essential, and that's the second element. So the traditional utility business model, I think we all know, utilities recover their cost of providing the service, plus a regulated return on capital. And the more capital that's deployed, the greater the profit. The more capital, the higher the rates to customers, unless there are more customers to share the cost. Well, what's wrong with the model Well, first of all, it's expensive. We can't be surprised we have a business which has such a low average capacity utilization. If you pay a business based upon how much capital they deploy, they're going to deploy a lot of capital. The second thing is it's a deterrent to the adoption of new technology. So things like IT, which have revolutionized other industries, every other industry, is not capital in many cases for a utility, in which case there's no profit opportunity, or it displaces traditional capital, in which case, again, there's no financial incentive for deployment. And what's also wrong with the model is it tends to discourage the use of distributed energy resources, because those areas of grid constraint, those areas in purple I just talked about before, it would be in those areas where the utility would have the incentive to try to deploy capital to widen the areas of grid constraint, as opposed to deploying distributed resources inside of the areas of grid constraint. So this is a typical customer bill, and the utility profit is 6 to 7% of the bill of a customer, and that means that 93 to 94% of the customer bill is a pass-through cost on which the utility earns nothing. And so every other business that we know of, this 93 to 94% is a wallet share opportunity, an opportunity for the utility or for the business, to innovate and to find ways to improve value and reduce costs for customers and earn some more for the business. And that has not been an opportunity for the utility industry. So the old utility model, again, simple, commits capital to build the grid, gets paid for how much capital it deploys, and is indifferent, at least in New York, to energy inefficiency. They don't get paid no more, but also no less, depending on how much customers use. The new utility model that we want to strive for is from the IT world. I want you to think about the utility as a systems integrator. That it certainly gets paid for the capital that it deploys, and New York has got an old system, so there's still going to be plenty of opportunity to deploy capital. But the utility should also get paid for more efficient deployment of other people's capital in the DER world, and has a positive incentive for energy efficiency as opposed to just being indifferent. So an example of this new model is an area not far from Manhattan and Brooklyn and Queens. Manhattan on the left part, the island. And in this case, the traditional solution was an area of load growth. Con Ed, the local utility, was going to spend $1.2 billion in new substations. And we can imagine that those substations would have had about a 54% average capacity utilization. So instead of an RFP for new substations, Con Ed went out to the market for really requests for solutions and provided the market participants with information about the grid location in that area and projected demand growth. And what came back was a whole wide range of alternatives that included solar, storage, energy efficiency, combined heat and power, and demand response. These solutions, instead of costing $1.2 billion, cost $200 million. And so that's $1 billion in savings to ratepayers. And that doesn't include the reduction in peak power costs that would be very expensive delivering power in the middle of summer to New York. And it doesn't take into account greater resilience, and it's a cleaner solution. And because the system is so financially inefficient, as this model has developed now to involve every utility's capital plans in the state, the utilities earn as much money as they would have earned had they deployed capital in the traditional way. So there are now dozens of these what are called non-wire solutions that take place in the state. So there are a couple ways of compensating utility for this new approach. One is through performance-based regulation, and I think you're familiar with RIO. That's an example, performance-based regulation. I happen to prefer the shared savings model, which is what we've done mostly in New York. If it cost $1 billion of saving, let's figure out what we should, as opposed to, if there's $1 billion of savings, let's figure out what the allocation of savings should be between ratepayers, the utility, and the DER market. So again, utilities don't own any generation in New York State. The biggest single cost is not capital. It's actually the fuel costs, which are the wholesale power, which the utility goes into the market, wholesale market, and purchases for most customers. Markup, and so the question is now, under this new model, we can find out and go beyond just this capital portion of the bill to the power portion, power supply portion of the bill, which is almost half. And we're going to see now if negawatts are a possible business for utility, which again creates a positive financial incentive for energy efficiency. So the last part is trying to stimulate grid edge activity with government resources. And so we fund clean energy in New York State through a surcharge on utility bills that's established by the regulator. It does not come from taxes. And we impose meaningful charges on customers, over $1 billion a year. And in the past, 85% of that was in the form of one-time grants. And that's great, but you're not creating scale. And so, you can put up some residential solar projects, but what's better is to figure out how to reduce soft costs, because even a state as large as New York has no influence on the costs of hardware. But we can have a meaningful influence on soft costs, so the costs of customer origination or cost of financing. And that's how we've tried to migrate our support programs. And so a solarized program where a community gets together and learns about residential solar reduces the cost of customer acquisition. We didn't invent this program. That was invented in Oregon State, but we have dozens of these kinds of programs and across the state for solar, and it's informed really everything that we try to do with our support programs. So the other reason why this competitive market is, and getting the competitive market right, is we need to build an IT system on top of the physical grid. And so if you think about your phone, if you have an Apple phone or Samsung phone, doesn't really matter, but Apple, just as an example, doesn't develop the apps. It just has a platform. And it's the app developers, competitive market as it were, that creates a feedback loop to Apple so that Apple knows how to invest in the platform to make it ever more valuable to the app developers. And we think we need that kind of interface between the utility, which would build a basic IT platform, and the competitive market actors. And so that's how really all these pieces fit together. I should say, all these pieces must fit together in order to drive capital to build the grid of the future. So we've said that through the value of DER, competitive markets will have the price signals to build the competitive nodes in places of the grid, which are going to be valuable not just to the hosts, but to all customers on the grid. The utilities now, as the systems integrator, have the financial incentives to encourage renewables, to partner with DER where they can't own DER but can get paid for, as an example with that Brooklyn and Queens example, through savings that come from deployment of DER in grid-constrained areas. They have a financial incentive now to get into the energy efficiency business. And it's this interface between utilities and competitive market actors that will build the IT system to help optimize the system. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. We'll come back to you in the Q&A period. Philip, if you want to open your camera and speak, and I think you don't have a presentation, but if you do have one, the screen is yours in any way.
Thank you, Pierre-Olivier. Merci beaucoup. J'ai en fait une présentation, quelques acétates, et franchement, j'essaie de voir comment partager.
Share screen at the bottom of your Zoom interface.
Got it. Merci. OK. Vous voyez mon écran?
Oui, c'est parfait.
Superbe. OK. Merci beaucoup. Et tout d'abord, vraiment, je voulais te remercier, Pierre-Olivier, pour cette invitation. Et également, franchement, vous féliciter là, parce que je trouve l'initiative vraiment intéressante pour le Québec. Je trouve cette approche d'une espèce de mini colloque et discussion vraiment rafraîchissante. Je m'excuse un peu à l'avance. Comme Pierre-Olivier a mentionné, on m'a demandé de parler en anglais, donc je vais passer à ma langue maternelle. Richard, I'm going to pass over to English now. So let me just, first of all, see if my slides will work, because for some reason, okay, there we go. So let me just say very quickly, for those who don't know who we are, just in a very quick nutshell, we've been around for 17 years. I've been working on these issues for 30 years. We're very focused on a single thing, which is accelerating the energy transition. We have a team of 40 people who do nothing but this every single day. We have about 500 projects and counting that we've done over time across the full spectrum of clean energy transition issues. And we do that for a clientele that is largely utilities and governments and government agencies. Not exclusively, but I'd say 3/4. And one of the reasons why I say that is that our clientele gives us a certain perspective on this. If you look at our kind of client logo spaghetti map here, one thing you might notice is that in pretty much every place that we work for both sides of the equation. So we work for the utilities, we work for the government agencies. And oftentimes that includes working for the regulators as well. In Quebec, we work for Hydro-Québec and Énergie and Gazifère and the Régie de l'Énergie and different government departments. The same thing is true in Ontario, the utilities and the regulator and government. In California, same thing, the utilities, the regulator and government. In New York, we don't work for the regulator, but we work for the utilities and for NYSERDA, actually Richard's organization. So it gives us a certain perspective on some of these issues, which are typically really easy to talk about and not so easy to do and not so easy to get right. And I got to say, I commend Richard for the extraordinary work that New York has done with the REV, the Reforming the Energy Vision, to really grapple with this and take a holistic look at it, and I'll say tame the beast, if you will, which it was quite an endeavor. I'm gonna share some thoughts. Richard was kind enough to share his slides with me in advance, so I had a chance to look at them, and I wanted to just share some thoughts about some of the lessons that I think that Quebec can take from the New York experience and example, some of which is extraordinarily relevant to us, some of which is not, of course, which is always the case. So let me just start with a really big picture here. First off, recognizing the problem. I think that's the most important thing that we need to do. And there are really a couple of problems. One is that traditional utility regulation is fundamentally a defensive action. It's always been that. It's the culture of regulation is playing defense. We are there to control costs. We're there to make sure that utilities don't overcharge so that rates remain as low as possible. And that worked reasonably well. There are issues with it, and Richard raised some of them, but it worked reasonably well in a past where things were pretty steady and I'll say almost simple, when all we were trying to do is make sure that the new power plant was the cheapest possible power plant, and we weren't investing needlessly in infrastructure. But in today's world, we need to be much more on the offense, and the offense in part because of the fundamental energy transition challenges that we're taking on, and in part because there is so much innovation going on that we need to make sure that we're harnessing that innovation. And you can't harness innovation from a position of defense. So I think that's one of the first things I think is important to recognize when we talk about utility regulation. A second thing is that Quebec really is different. It's not just our language, it's also the way our market and industry is structured. In particular, of course, I'm talking about Hydro-Quebec. Both the fact that Hydro-Quebec's size is almost without parallel, in fact, is without parallel when you consider the market that it plays in, and because it's a crown corporation, and that really changes things. So, when we're in New York looking at publicly traded utilities or privately owned utilities that are regulated, their fundamental interest is maximizing profit, and the utility regulator has some very clear levers to incentivize utilities in that way. In Quebec, when we talk about Hydro-Quebec, of course, it's a very different context. Of course, Hydro-Quebec wants to maximize profit, but it's owned by government. And so it is very sensitive to rate increases. It is not looking to radically increase rates because its sole shareholder would not accept that in the first place. And so there's a bit of a different play. And that means that, for example, our ability to play with regulatory frameworks focused on performance it's still there, but it's less of a direct impact. So I just want to recognize that. That said, and actually let me say one other thing. Richard started out his presentation, and very appropriately, pointing out the 16 states where markets really are deregulated, including New York. And that's something that can happen in New York, can happen in throughout the Northeast of the US. Quebec is probably going to be the last place in North America to have a fully deregulated retail market. And I think we need to recognize that, frankly, in large part, because not only of Hydro-Quebec's size, but the size of its generators, the enormous market power that you get from having, multi-thousand megawatt interseasonal, in fact, interannual storage hydro projects, really changes the equation for what you can do in terms of retail competition. So within that context, I think one of the things that we need to do is really think through, well, what can we emulate? What can we take from what the good that a competitive market can produce, and emulate it through our regulatory frameworks. So let me start with one piece that Richard focused on in his presentation, and I'll say location, location, location. So in particular, Richard talked about locational pricing and locational valuation. I want to talk about the valuation side. In Quebec, we have a long history of using, when we talk about avoided costs, when we talk about the economic benefits of pretty much anything that we do on the electricity side, for example, we measure it against, the benefits are measured as avoided costs. And in the past, we've tended to treat avoided costs as an average. And averages, again, worked reasonably well in the past. They are a pretty blunt tool, and worse still, especially today, can really harm innovation going forward. And as we go forward, the value of avoided costs by location is going to increase, is increasing, and is going to continue to increase quite dramatically. I think it's really important that we account for that so that we're actually being a lot more efficient in how we allocate capital, how we go out and make investments. So to give an example, we go to the next point, which is we need to understand the locational opportunities for DERs. So actually, let me pull that off for a second. Let me give an example of when I talk about the locational value of DERs. If we think increasingly that we're going to be electrifying heating, we're going to need obviously more generation, we're going to need more transmission, we're going to need more distribution. If we think about electrifying heating of buildings in Montreal, for example, in the heart of Montreal, for example, our current substations, if we were to electrify everything, are insufficient. And adding capacity to a substation, or probably more realistically, adding more substations in, let's say, the Côte-Nord is one thing. Doing so in the heart of Montreal is another. So if we can work on reducing peak demand in the heart of Montreal, that's going to be worth an awful lot more than reducing the same peak demand in, let's say, La Côte-Nord or in Gaspésie, where Suzanne is. The more we can account for that, the more we can minimize costs of the entire system and achieve our decarbonization at lower costs. So to do that, one of the first things we need to do is understand, well, what is the opportunity to actually reduce peak demand or promote DERs? And sorry, I'm realizing DERs, I should say, stands for distributed energy resources. So, we're talking about energy efficiency, we're talking about peak demand reductions, we're talking about solar, we're talking about distributed storage opportunities, we're talking about electric vehicles. All of those things, we need to understand what the potential is, not just for Quebec as a whole, but in very specific pockets within Quebec. So just to give you an example, we're currently doing, Richard actually presented a great example of NWA, non-wire alternatives, which are fundamentally DERs, so demand side resources that are very location specific. We're doing that same work right now in another state in the Northeast US, where we're being asked to look at what is the potential for energy savings, for peak demand savings, for EV adoption, for heating electrification in very specific geographic areas that are aligned with distribution grid needs, so that we can figure out where, for the grid, where's the best place to emphasize or to put in more heating electrification, and where are the highest value pockets for emphasizing or for focusing in on energy efficiency and on demand response or peak reduction programs. So that kind of, getting more sophisticated, getting more granular, getting more accurate is one thing that we can do here in Quebec. Before I forget, one other thing, when we talk about trying to avoid transmission and distribution investments or to defer those investments by putting more emphasis on demand side resources, we can't do that if we don't see the needs coming right now. And this is not just in Quebec, this is in most places across North America. We do generation planning. We don't do a lot of distribution planning. We kind of wait to the last minute until we see the need to upgrade a substation, and then it's 18 months ahead of us, and we go and do it, and we invest that capital. We need to, like California now does, require that utilities actually plan ahead, do advanced planning of their distribution needs, so that we can actually have a chance to bring in those alternatives at a lower cost for the system as a whole. All right, that's location, location, location. A few others. Assessing the full value stack. Again, this is something that Richard alluded to, incredibly important. And Monsieur Dumas referred briefly earlier this morning to addressing non-energy benefits to a certain extent. this is something that matters an awful lot. So again, just an example, we're just doing work now for one regulator in the US who has asked us to look into about 20 different discrete values of demand side energy resources, not just the energy savings. The energy savings, the value of the capacity savings, the value of reserves, the value of ancillary services, the value of market price impacts that are known as DRIPE in the Northeast. Environmental values, of course, not just greenhouse gas emission reductions, but others as well. The benefits for system reliability, the benefits from a risk reduction perspective for the market, the long-term benefits of actually transforming markets. So we're going to be looking at the benefits of all of these things to try to understand, all right, if I invest in energy efficiency, and if I invest in peak reduction, the sorts of things that Hilo is doing, what is the full value that I'm avoiding? And if I can calculate the full value, then quite frankly, I have a much better chance of avoiding much more cost. But if I don't, then I'm going to be artificially limiting my ability to invest in demand side resources because I'm not going to be accounting for that full value stack. And that actually leads to one other little note, which is if we are to do that, we need to accept uncertainty. And that is not something that comes naturally to a regulated environment, but it's something that we need to do. I go back, I remember when I started in this business about 30 years ago, I remember listening to the president of the Vermont regulator at the time. His name was Richard Coworth, and he gave a presentation where he talked about ostrich math. And ostrich math is very simple. It said, there are some things that we know they're worth something, we don't know what they're worth, and therefore we value them at zero because we're afraid of getting it wrong. When the only thing that we know that is wrong is zero. So we need to accept uncertainty when we're doing this. We need to account for these additional values, and environmental being one example, as best we possibly can, given and accepting the uncertainty involved, so that again we're making the best possible decisions. All right. The third thing that we can do in Quebec is focus on, and again, this is something that Richard was talking about, and it's frankly the core focus of the REV in New York, is the regulatory incentives. Regulatory incentives that we're providing to utilities that sometimes are not really aligned with our end game, and that's what we need to do. Is focus them on the end game. So we need to consider performance-based frameworks. Now, we have in the past. I was personally very deeply involved in defining the first performance-based framework that Quebec adopted with Gaz Métro at the time in the early 2000s. Very interesting thing. Until then, we were using that same old cost of service rate of return model that, as Richard pointed out, really just incents putting capital in the ground. And we switched over to a performance-based framework. The performance-based framework, it wasn't my perfect platonic ideal, but it did a pretty good job at aligning incentives. And one of the things that happened was within a single year after we adopted that new framework, Gaz Métro at the time, now Énergie, multiplied by a factor of 10 their investments in energy efficiency. Why? Because suddenly what mattered to Énergie's bottom line was not putting capital in the ground, but minimizing the total cost for all ratepayers and all consumers. And of course, as we know, energy efficiency can often reduce costs or achieve balanced supply and demand at a much lower cost than the new supply. So that sort of thing, I think, is really important, that we consider performance-based frameworks to the extent that we can, and that we ask ourselves, what is performance? What is success? Is it lowest cost? Is it maximizing benefits? Is it achieving climate goals? And increasingly, when we look around North America, and again, this is something that, it's a 30-year-old debate, but increasingly now we're coming back to regulatory frameworks that incentivize maximizing total benefits, maximizing societal benefits, and in fact, increasingly achieving climate goals as well. So if we don't have those built into our definition of success and built into the incentives that we give to our utilities, how can we possibly expect a different outcome? Another thing, if we are going to try to focus on performance rather than control, we need to allow flexibility. Utilities can't deliver if we're trying to control every single thing that they do year over year over year. This is a much more dynamic market environment than we were in 15, 20, 25 years ago. So much is changing all the time. If our utilities are not allowed to innovate because we put them in a straitjacket and we say, this was your plan, we accept this, and you cannot budge from it for the next year or 2 years, then we don't allow them to innovate, and effectively we minimize their ability to succeed for us. So allowing flexibility means, among other things, multi-year regulatory frameworks. A couple more things, and then I'll stop. One really, by the way, all of these things, of course, are really easily said and harder to do. One thing that increasingly we need to do, and we're facing this and we're dealing with this with a lot of our clients throughout North America now, is breaking the electric gas utility silos. So, we all know that if we're going to decarbonize, we can't do it in silos, or if we choose to do it in silos, the costs are going to be needlessly high. Quebec is absolutely leading the way right now in terms of, or I should say through this very innovative, I'll say partnership or collaboration between Hydro-Quebec and Énergie to look at how do we actually decarbonize in an optimized way? How do we use both energy systems in an optimal way to achieve our decarbonization goals? That's fantastic. Now the regulator needs to make sure that that can happen. And of course, we all know Énergie and Hydro-Quebec have already announced that they'll be submitting a joint application soon from a rates perspective. Honestly, this is a fantastic innovation coming out of Quebec. I have many clients elsewhere that are looking to this and asking about it, and are rather envious to see that this is actually possible. So that's an area that is critical and where we're actually one of the first movers forward. That said, we can do more, and others are doing more already in other respects. In particular, in how we account for, or how we calculate cost effectiveness in particular. Oftentimes, cost effectiveness calculations are done in silos, unfortunately. Electric plans account for electric savings, gas plans account for gas savings, and they're not allowed to account for the benefits that they generate for the other fuel or the other energy source. Increasingly elsewhere, that is possible. Increasingly, we're talking about, in Richard's case, MMBTU goals, or we would call them gigajoule goals, as opposed to strictly gigawatt hour goals and strictly cubic meter goals. So that becomes increasingly important. And Pierre-Olivier, I believe this is my last slide here.
Thank you very much.
All right. One last thought. We need to give careful consideration, and this is not a simple one, to utility investments in new opportunity areas. And in particular, I have in mind electric vehicles. This is a huge debate elsewhere, whether and to what extent the electric utility should be allowed to invest in charging infrastructure. I will say in Quebec, we've already taken that route. And quite frankly, I think it's worked extremely well. I think that we are an excellent example of how to do things. And so again, an area where in this case we're probably ahead. It's there. This is a debatable point, and it's an interesting debate. But my feeling is, having looked elsewhere, there's a real value proposition for utilities to invest in charging infrastructure that does not exist for the private market right now, for some of the reasons that Sylvain Odette mentioned earlier as well. And other opportunities are a little bit trickier and might actually lend themselves more to third-party investments. And that's an area where we need to just be careful that we don't allow Hydro-Québec to monopolize and crowd out, call them grid edge opportunities where the private market could play a role. So I'll stop there. I wanted to just share those thoughts, and thank you, and happy to respond to any questions or discuss more with Richard as well. Merci, Pierre-Olivier.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Thank you, Richard. We're supposed to end at 1:45, but I will take the next 13 minutes until 2 to take questions. So there's been some questions on the chat room. So I'll start with Jean-Pierre Finet's question, which I'm not sure I fully understand, but it's directed at Richard Kaufman. Do you agree, Richard, with Hydro-Québec's technical limit of 5% of the lower demand for DER? And maybe, Jean-Pierre, you could jump in to make your question clearer, unless Richard has an answer.
Well, I don't know enough about the technical configuration of Hydro-Québec, but I think that most electric grids have, even under the current architecture, can have a much higher penetration of DER at 5%.
Okay, because it's a problem. They're limiting the potential introduction of distributed energy to 5% of the lowest, not of the winter peak demand, but of the lowest summer demand. So it really is a limit on a barrier on the potential for that.
Yeah. So one of the questions here, I would say, is, are they talking about this because they think there are technical constraints, or are they talking about it because they think there's going to be a cost shifting effect? Because
they used to think it was the death spiral, but it's more of a technical challenge, it seems, to integrate.
Yeah, and I would be skeptical about that, but I'm not an engineer. But Philippe, maybe you have a view because you work with lots of other utilities.
I mean, I can certainly say that elsewhere, 5%, well, certainly there are many areas or many regions where the limit is far higher than 5%. I believe just south of us in Vermont, if I'm not mistaken, it's around 15% or so. That said, Hydro-Québec really, just recently in the past few years invested more significantly in the smart grid. So that, I think, is really critical to understanding what the grid can take better. And I'm hoping that with that better understanding, this could probably be lifted.
Thank you.
Charles Seguin has a really good question to this one through the death spiral. And he asks you, Richard, what you propose, does it avoid the utility death spiral?
Yeah. I mean, I really think that there are lots of opportunities for utilities, given how financially inefficient the system is. So, and other industries have had the benefit of 30 or almost 40 years of thinking about how innovation can reduce costs and improve value to customers, which really has not gone to the electric utility industry. So that's why I think that if we think about the importance of reducing customer bills and think about that customer bill as a revenue opportunity, then who knows what could come out of that. I mean, I think about, I don't know, things like tree trimming is a significant cost. Right now, that's just a pass-through cost. Maybe there's a new business for figuring out how to do trimming. If you can save customers money, you want to give utilities an opportunity to earn a share of savings. I picked that as a trivial example. And then beyond that, when we think about the DER market and the smart grid and the range of how much additional value we can get out of electrons, we don't really know. I mean, Edison was initially just lighting, the invention of lighting, but we use electricity for a lot more than that now. We've been talking to people interested in home health care as an example that would be cheaper and provide better care. So a home health care system, would require an underlying smart home where part of the business model can help provide services to the grid. So a utility that creates the platform that enables that business utility, that's the equivalent of the app. And so just in the same way that Apple earns a share of revenue from apps, we don't, if we can create that innovation of services that can be around customers, that's another opportunity for utilities to earn revenue. So I think that opening up the industry to more innovation avoids the utility death spiral, and frankly, just kind of hoping that it's not going to go away. I'm hoping that the industry trends are to try to fight against the forces that are going along in the electric utility industry. I think only are going to make the utilities problems greater if they don't change.
I would ask you now, well, don't you think there has to be a change in how people pay? Because, people still pay by kilowatt hour. And I agree with all you say, but you don't really mention, there has to be some tariff changes or a change in how people pay.
Is that for?
Yeah, go ahead, Philippe. Yeah, please.
I just wasn't sure if you meant that for me or for Richard.
It was for Richard, but you can go ahead.
Well, I'll just say I agree with you. I mean, there's no doubt that we can't have grossly inefficient rates, right? And increasingly, as capacity becomes an issue, especially with the needs for electrification, that's becoming a problem. At the same time, I have to recognize that there are other problems associated with capacity pricing, especially in Quebec, where we have made a point of encouraging so many people to heat with electricity in a very cold climate. So there are real challenges with moving there, but I think ultimately we absolutely have to move there.
Yeah, so I agree. I mean, we don't charge appropriately by, we know real estate, people get used to being charged by location. We don't do that. There's an issue about whether there should be the dial tone, basic flat cost for providing some level of service as opposed to it being based upon volume. That's caused a problem in the environmental community because they believe that it is incentive to energy efficiency. So that's an issue. And then I think the whole point, and I don't know what it is in Quebec, but time of use pricing, which permit cannot be imposed on residential customers. It is imposed on commercial and industrial customers.
Philippe, a question from Sylvain that as you emphasize location, and still on the rates, would you go as far as stopping the uniform rate policy we have in Quebec and to have more locationally based prices?
No, I wouldn't. First of all, because I would Suzanne would be very upset with me. And second of all, in all seriousness, that was a policy decision that we made in Quebec about 70 odd years ago now, and I think there's a lot of good value to that policy. There's no reason. I don't think that anyone wants to go back to a time when power costs 3 times as much in Gaspé as it does in Montreal. That having been said, I think that again, good regulation can emulate markets, and so without going to that, we can account for location-specific value in the cost-effectiveness analysis that we do when we're determining where to invest, right, and what solutions to invest in where to minimize cost. So I think that is it's the balanced approach that I think makes sense for Quebec, but that it doesn't go and backtrack on that historic decision.
But so you wouldn't provide any price signal to consumers, only for investment, but no for consumers.
Yes, and again, from a pure policy perspective of social regional equity, right? I mean, that's, this isn't a purely economist question. It's a broader question. I think that equity issue matters a lot in Quebec.
Good. We have Franklin Gertler, and sorry, Franklin, for not pronouncing your name correctly, who really wants the disappearance of natural gas networks. So he's asking, well, Franklin, go ahead and ask your question.
Well, hi, thank you. I listened to Jean-Olivier this morning, so I brought my bicycle, but that means I left my light glasses at home. So it's the Mr. Big look today. In any case, yeah, my question was, to my perception, the regulatory framework is entirely designed for the permanent viability of the regulated utility, and in the case of Énergie, that's actually meaning that the provincial government is subsidizing the extension of their network. And I'm wondering about models that will allow us to actually say, look, this is your time limited. We cannot be increasing our dependence and our hardwiring to the distribution of fossil fuels. And I'll be very honest with you, I don't think that the GNR or the renewable natural gas idea is viable either from an energy point of view or an environmental point of view. We're going to empty our countrysides and our forests of all organic matter, and we're going to go on using shale gas with all that entails in terms of greenhouse gases and other environmental damage. So I'm asking about models for, we no longer distribute coal gas, and we no longer deliver ice to people's doors and other things. So I want to know about models for moving out of certain kinds of utilities within the framework of a regulatory structure.
So if I could just maybe quickly, I know we're almost out of time, I'd make 2 points. One is I think that we can, from a policy standpoint, start putting renewable hydrogen into the gas pipelines. I agree that biogas is not going to be the answer, but over time, there is the possibility of creating synthetic natural gas from our synthetic hydrocarbons, from electrolyzing to get hydrogen and capturing CO2 from the air. And you can create any kind of molecule. And so I think we can get started with some small things that wouldn't cost customers. A clean concrete standard that would also start stimulating to air capture business. So that's one point. The second point is I think that from a regulatory standpoint, I think we want to provide an appropriate balance of risk between the utility and ratepayers, where for extensions of the natural gas distribution system, some of it can be borne through the rate base, but some of it has to work with a risk sharing where the utility has a financial incentive to explore alternative sources for the natural gas. So in other words, don't give them a 50-year cost recovery of that asset. And there's some number between 1 and 50, I don't know what the number is, where the utility ought to be prepared to essentially take that kind of risk, where they would earn, some kind of superior return beyond the traditional traditional cost of capital. If you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, our board has recently recommitted itself to a 40-year, which is the engineering life of the pipelines rather than the climate
Yeah, that's right.
policy horizon, which we should be considering. And that is
Yeah, so that's why maybe you give you give them a 20-year traditional cost recovery, but then after that they have the opportunity to to earn a 20% return on that, right? So then either it gets repurposed or they're out of business on that asset. They have to suffer the loss of
so
half the
after
value.
20 years, they have to.
I'll stop you here, and I'll just give Philippe, a chance to add something if he has to, or if he wants to on that.
Sure. Thanks, Pierre. Yeah, I just want to say, this is a really, really tough issue, of course, but I think that, look, if we're going to decarbonize, the cost is extraordinary, and we need to decarbonize. And anyone who knows me knows that that's, the focus of my life is decarbonizing. But I don't think that our focus should be on, let's say, ripping out pipe from the ground, right? I think that our focus should be on using that pipe in low or no carbon ways. And so, that asset, it's already invested, it's already in there. Let's make sure that we use it. Let's make sure that we're filling it up with, yes, RNG in the near term, in the long term, hydrogen, in all likelihood. Let's use it to minimize the added cost of peak electricity as we partially electrify. I think there's a lot of ways that we can use this to our benefit rather than just try to eliminate it altogether.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for listening and providing good questions. Thank you, Richard and Philippe, for your very insightful presentations. The discussion will continue tomorrow with most of you. You're all tomorrow and Friday. Some of you are on tomorrow's table, and then some of you are on Friday's table. Je peux continuer en français puisque c'est vraiment nos affaires domestiques. Donc, ce sera des plus petits groupes. On a des questions qu'on vous a déjà transmises, qu'on va traiter dans ces tables de discussion. Donc, vous allez avoir encore plus de chances d'occasion de parler demain et vendredi. Et n'oubliez pas, l'idée, c'est d'amener les idées les plus innovatrices pour essayer de faire évoluer la réglementation en énergie au Québec. Donc, il n'y a pas de mauvaises idées. Il faut amener les choses sur la table. Il faut essayer de les amener de manière constructive en comprenant l'ensemble des contraintes auxquelles nous faisons face et essayer de collaborer pour avoir des propositions les plus fortes. Alors, n'hésitez pas à nous écrire si vous avez des choses par courriel. Sinon, on se voit demain pour certains d'entre vous et vendredi pour les autres. Bonne fin de journée et à très bientôt.